Look.
Chevy Suburban, like a rock.
20 years ago this week, an assassination took place in San Francisco that not only changed the future political makeup of the city, but also seemed to shatter the already fragile emotions of the entire Bay Area. On segment 2 tonight, we take a look back at the killing of Mayor George Moscone and Supervisor Harvey Milk, and how U.S. Senator Dianne Feinstein remembers that fateful morning.
On November 27, 1978, the Bay Area was still reeling from the stunning events in Jonestown, in which more than 900 people had lost their lives just 9 days earlier. We thought nothing that wrenching could occur again so soon. We were wrong.
Both Mayor Moscone and Supervisor Harvey Milk have been shot and killed. The suspect is Supervisor Dan White.
The Bay Area was reeling again, this time over the assassination of 2 of San Francisco's most prominent elected officials.
It was incomprehensible. It was incomprehensible. And Dan White, as a killer, was incomprehensible. So when I went out to make the announcement, I felt, I mean, it was like I wasn't in this world. I wasn't in the world. I knew I was in some other world.
George Moscone, the city's liberal mayor who had won election by a razor-thin margin. Moscone had just spent the weekend celebrating his 49th birthday. Harvey Milk, who ran a camera shop in the Castro district and had become the city's first openly gay elected supervisor. The man who shot them, Dan White, had been a San Francisco cop, a San Francisco firefighter, had just days earlier resigned as a city supervisor to run a small business on Pier 39 called the Hot Potato. He wanted his supervisor's job back, and on that fateful Monday morning, Dan White had learned Moscone was going to give the seat to someone else.
Dan had asked Harvey to help him, and apparently Harvey had told him that he would. And then Harvey had counseled the mayor not to reappoint him, saying, you know, you'd be foolish to get somebody that's going to vote with you. So Dan apparently overheard a conversation, and I think that partially set him off. I don't know, but over 20 years I've thought a lot about it, and this is actually my belief.
Dan White left home that morning to confront George Moscone after learning that he was going to appoint someone else to his old seat. Before leaving home, he loaded his old police revolver, then he grabbed 10 extra bullets, wrapped them into a handkerchief, and put them into his pocket.
He entered City Hall through a basement window to avoid metal detectors, made his way to Moscone's office, and after a brief wait was let in to see him. Moments later, Moscone was dead, and White headed for Milk's office, passing Dianne Feinstein on the way.
All of a sudden, the door opened, and Dan swept right by me, and I said, Dan, can you stop? And he said, no, I have to do something. And
he was on his way to see Harvey.
He was on his way to see Harvey. I heard the door slam. I heard the shots. I didn't know what they were, and I smelled the gunpowder, and Dan quickly walked by me and said, not now, and was out the door.
A short while later, White turned himself in to his old friend, Police Inspector Frank Falzone. He made this confession on tape. It was the only time the jury would hear his voice.
He was talking, and nothing was getting through to me. It was just like a roaring in my ears, and, you know, it just wasn't registering what I was going to do now, and, you know, and how this would affect my family, and, you know, and just all the time knowing he's going to go out and lie to the press and tell them, you know, that I wasn't a good supervisor and that people didn't want me, and then that was it. Then I just shot him.
After shooting Moscone, Dan White briskly walked to the other side of City Hall to the supervisor's chambers, pausing briefly in his old office to reload. He then confronted Harvey Milk.
And then he started kind of smirking, because he knew I wasn't going to be reappointed. As if to say, too bad. And then I just got all flushed and hot, and he shot him.
Falzone was later accused of being soft on interrogating his old buddy. Prosecutor Tom Norman was accused of bungling a slam-dunk case of premeditated first-degree murder. Jurors wept during the playing of White's confession. They deliberated for several days, and when they returned the verdict, it was not first-degree murder, but voluntary manslaughter. White was sentenced to prison, but what happened next caught many people by surprise.
If you look that way, you can see it coming and get out of the way.
I returned to City Hall that night and was there and watched this crowd be transfixed into an absolute mob. There was no reasoning with that crowd of people. Saw the police become overwhelmed, squad cars exploding, rocks being thrown, breaking windows, the ironwork being broken, the police being encircled, then the general trashing of the area.
Dan White would spend only 5 years in prison. On October 21st, 1986, less than 8 years after he shot George Moscone and Harvey Milk, Dan White walked into his garage, started the motor of his car, and took his own life. The events had now come full circle. Dan White's name and picture were splashed all over the front pages and on the news programs on that November day in 1978. In sharp contrast, when he took his own life, his body lay in a dark garage filled with deadly fumes. Few people mourned Dan White's death, but what he had done in life had a major impact. No longer could a criminal defendant count on Dan White's so-called Twinkie defense or diminished capacity defense in a criminal case. Harvey Milk, who at one time predicted his own violent death, would become a martyr to the gay community. The city erected statues to its slain mayor and named a major economic development in his honor. Mayor Dianne Feinstein would go on to become Senator Feinstein, and there are those who would argue San Francisco was forced to change politically, from a city of political extremes on both sides to a city that has moved more toward the political center. But that's an argument that continues even today. Dennis Richmond for Segment 2.